Hopefully my recording today is not too noisy. I am recording this while I'm waiting for my van at the shop, so there's some background noise. By now you should be able to describe the three main types of labor in the American colonies. It is hard for us to imagine, but their society really didn't have very many people who were just looking to get a job. With this video, we're going to focus back on our unit target, which is to compare and contrast the political rights and economic activities of the three colonial regions. We'll spend a little time comparing the regions and the types of labor used in each region. This map shows where enslaved people were sold in U.S. history. Notice the flags and labels marking New England, Middle, and Southern colonies. Whew, I'm having a hard time controlling that cursor. So, New England, Middle, and Southern colonies, you see the flags now. We are focused on the colonial era. This map has pink dots for places where people were bought and sold only during the colonial era, and purple dots for the places where slave trade was conducted both during the colonial era and afterward. We will ignore the two yellow dots for now because they were not places that traded enslaved people during the colonial times. So, focusing on the pink and purple dots, which regions had slave trading ports during the colonial era? Some people think slavery was only part of the South. Is that true? You should have noticed that all three regions traded in enslaved people. Now look at the size of the dots. A larger dot indicates more people were sold, and a smaller dot means fewer people were sold. Which region had the smallest number of people sold as slaves? I'm sure that you saw that New England had the fewest people sold as slaves, though the middle colonies aren't far behind as far as small numbers. We have one port in New York that traded quite a few, but others, that's about the only main slave trading port in the middle colonies. The South, of course, this group of pink dots is in the South, as is this larger purple dots. So what facts are shown on this map that could lead to people connecting slavery to the South and forgetting that it was also allowed in the Middle and New England colonies? Both the cluster of pink dots around Virginia and the large purple dot at Charleston, South Carolina were in the Southern colonies. Clearly, the Southern colonies relied on slavery much more than people in the New England and the Middle colonies. Now let's compare indentured servants and slaves. The stories of John Punch and Melchior Plank hopefully have helped you understand the similarities and differences between slavery and indentured servitude. Let's look at the timeline of Melchior Plank's life to help us focus on these two types of labor. We'll look at how their service begins and then at the end. Take a moment to look over this timeline, the first part, or just look over your notes, then answer the questions that follow. Let me know if you feel like you need to talk with a classmate to think this through better. First, you might have noticed they both came on a ship. Even though Melchior Plank didn't have a choice as far as we know, most indentured servants chose to come to the colonies, while most enslaved people were forced to come. This is a huge difference, but they did both come on a ship. Next, you should have realized they both work without any pay. Both get food and clothing, but are not given money for the hours they work. Indentured servants, of course, are working to pay off a debt, while enslaved people have no end date when they would expect to be freed. And one more similarity that I hope you realized is that neither one could choose who they worked for. Both could be given or sold to someone else. The key difference is that the contract was sold for indentured servants like Melchior. So that piece of paper, this right here, is what was sold for indentured servants. But the person was sold in slavery. Now let's look at how indentured servitude ends, because this is where we find many differences. Take a moment to look over this part of the timeline in your notes, and then answer the questions. If you missed a lot of the last set of questions, let me know, and I'll help you find someone that you can talk it through with as you answer these questions. I'm pretty sure you found the first difference because it's the absolute most important difference between slavery and indentured servitude. Indentured servants were freed after about 5 to 7 years, while people who were enslaved had very little chance of ever becoming free. Enslaved people also had basically no rights for most of U.S. history. Melchior Plank was able to change his name, while people who were enslaved had to answer to whatever name the slaveholder wanted to call them. When a plantation owner bought a person, they could change that person's name, and enslaved parents did not always get to choose the name of their own children. And that brings us to the third difference on this slide. While Melchior Plank had 6 children who were able to live lives of their own choosing, children born to enslaved women were forced to become slaves who had no say over their own lives. John Punch's children were fortunate that their mother was not enslaved, so they escaped this cycle of slavery. Very few children of slaves share that part of his story. From 1808 to 1865, all of the African Americans in the U.S. who were sold as slaves had been born to an enslaved mother. It is estimated that a total of more than 9 million children were born into slavery in what is now the United States. Those children generally had no chance of getting their own farms and living their own lives the way they chose, even in the simple way that Melchior Plank's children did. Finally, here is a chart comparing 3 types of labor. Apprentices, remember you had that short video on apprentices. They were kind of like a combination of indentured servant and a student at a vocational program like at a school like WSU Tech, learning to do a skill. They had to do some boring tasks like cleaning, and they had to do whatever their master told them. But over the years, apprentices learned the skills that would allow them to run their own businesses. Let's think back to what you learned about the colonial regions. Go ahead and pull out your notes and look at the chart that shows the economic activities in the 3 regions from page 114 and 115 in the textbook. What economic activities would require years to learn the skill? This is kind of a take your best guess question. You might have guessed that shipbuilding would require several years to learn the skill. Some young men could have been apprentices to shipbuilders. There would have been apprenticeships related to rum making because a cooper or barrel maker was a skilled trade. While being the captain of a sailing ship takes years to learn, most sailors just learned on the job and didn't have a formal apprenticeship. So really, shipbuilding and rum making are about the only ones that would have had apprenticeships that are on those lists. Fishing and farming would usually have been a trade passed from father to son. Many of the other jobs learned by apprentices are not listed in your notes because they did the kinds of work that were needed for people in every city, right there. Building homes, you don't ship that across the world. People who were apprentices maybe don't show up on that chart as much. But basically, any place you had a city, you would have a large number of jobs that required apprentices. The middle colonies have the economic activity of trade listed. Merchants, that's the people who do the trading business, the one who own the trading business. Merchants would have needed strong men to load and unload ships, but that's not a skill that takes years to learn. Indentured servants or slaves would do that type of work. Farming takes some skill, but it also takes a lot of repeated tasks. New England and Middle Colonies farmers usually wanted indentured servants if they were needing extra help on their farms, because many of the indentured servants from Central Europe had grown up on farms. So look at the chart and compare each column and then answer the following questions. You probably saw that both apprentices and indentured servants worked for around 7 years and had contracts. This means they usually made a choice that led them to become an apprentice or indentured servant. On the other hand, enslaved people had no choice and very little chance of becoming free, even if they worked for 7 times as long as the apprentice or indentured servant. Take a look at the chart again. What do you notice that it is the same about all 3 types of labor? You probably saw that all 3 types of labor were unpaid. Keep in mind that even though indentured servants and apprentices were not paid, they stood to gain something that they wanted from their work. I want to make sure this point is very clear. While there are a number of similarities between enslaved people, indentured servants, and apprentices, slavery was much worse than the other 2 because it took away all self-determination from the enslaved person. The apprentice and the indentured servant both could look forward to being free, but most enslaved people had no hope of freedom. The indentured servant and apprentice could both look forward to life after their unpaid labor, and it would probably be a life better than the one they had before their service. Enslaved Africans, on the other hand, had been forced from their homes where they had families and were living the lives that they chose. If they survived the Middle Passage, they found themselves in an unfamiliar place with people they did not know, they didn't speak the language, and they were forced to do work with no hope of ever returning home. I cannot imagine a situation that would be worse than that. The effects of these 3 types of labor and the difference between rich people who own their own land or businesses and the poor people who do their work, these are the basic foundation for many of the events that we will talk about this year. The last section of the unit we'll look at next is about political rights. As we switch to the new topic, keep this topic of labor in mind. All of these laborers that we talked about, the apprentices, indentured servants, and slavery, none of them owned property. So in most places, they could not vote. They were not part of people who had political rights. As we go through the year, keep these 3 types of laborers in mind and watch for how their rights change over time, or how they don't change, as we study the history of our country.